This is episode 227.
Yeah, this week we talk with Michael Webermann from Better Eating.
You might remember him. We had him on about 2 years ago. He used to be the executive director for Farm.
Yeah.
But first,
Our Side.
This week we wanted to bring you an excerpt of a speech that Josh Harper did, really talking about the connection that he found between intersectionality and veganism, what drew those lines for him.
I just want to advise maybe a trigger warning on this one because there's some sensitive talking about abuse towards LGBT and animals.
There was an organization called the Oregon Christians Alliance, and they had had quite a bit of success in the state, passing these local-level city ordinances that actually legalized discriminating against people on the basis of their sexual preference. It made it so that these small towns, especially in the eastern part of the state, were allowed to fire teachers because they were homosexual, or not hire somebody for your business because they were transgender. Because of the success of this organization and the numbers that they were building, neo-Nazi skinheads had started to pour into the state because they saw an area that might now be ripe for recruiting. And so me and my friends at this age, we're punk rock kids, we're very rebellious, we're getting politicized, and we wanted to do something about what was going on. First, I joined an organization called Coalition for Human Dignity. They were one of the main voices trying to stop what was now a statewide initiative by the Oregon Christians Alliance to essentially illegalize homosexuality in the state. Right after the offices of this group started, it was firebombed by neo-Nazis. Shortly after that, I remember me and my friend Joe, who was the singer in a local punk band, we were walking down by the university in Eugene, the University of Oregon, and we saw an Oregon Christian Alliance rally going on. They're there holding their signs and spewing their vitriol. And I remember I kind of looked over at Joe. I'm like, we got to do something. We got to confront them. And so we walk up, and we don't really know what we're going to do. And when we get right up in front of them, I just embraced Joe, and we had this wonderful, deep kiss. And in that moment, I'm like, oh, man, I'm half gay. Which was a revelation because I hadn't quite figured it out before that. And anyway, we had this great moment, and we were able to piss off all the Oregon Christian Alliance people, and they were shouting at us, and we were flipping them off and giving it right back. And we walked away very happy with ourselves. But what we didn't know was that we were being followed by Nazi skinheads. We split up on an area of this street called East 13th. And I remember Joe walked towards this hospital directly across the street while I decided to head down this alleyway behind a convenience store. And it was there that the skinheads jumped me and beat me to the ground and began stomping on me and kicking me in the head and the ribs and stepping on my hands. And they broke my fingers, and they left me bruised and bloodied. And they kicked me in the kidneys till I was pissing blood in the alley. I wanted so badly to just go home and to be protected and to feel like I was able to escape this. But my father was a horribly homophobic man who had warned me many times during my youth that if I ever turned out to be queer, he was going to disown me. So I waited until very, very late at night. Because I wanted to make sure that he was going to be asleep. And I crept across town, aching and bleeding. And by the time I reached home, there was a doorway that led into our kitchen. It was the one that was more secluded and the one I thought he would be less likely to detect me entering. And I walked into the kitchen, and from across that door, we had a sliding glass door with sort of a back deck. And my father was on the back deck, and he was beating my dog, Max. And there was a very important shift in my thinking in that moment, because here was Max on the ground getting beaten as I had just been moments before. Now, I knew that Max couldn't speak my language. I knew that he didn't have the level of human intelligence that I had. He couldn't do geometry or program a computer, but none of that mattered. His level of intelligence was irrelevant because his ability to suffer was just the same as mine. And watching him try to escape that humiliation reminded me of the humiliation that I myself had just been put through moments before. Suddenly, non-humans were no longer there for me to enjoy the taste of their flesh or to enjoy the feel of their skin as shoes or a jacket. Suddenly, I realized that these creatures were individuals with the same sorts of desires that I had, who most certainly wanted to be free from suffering, if nothing else. The idea that I would attempt to take from them their freedom and their lives became absurd in my mind in just a split moment. And I started to feel more and more that this was something that I could no longer participate in.
This is one of the things I'm really interested in and how you're approaching this project, because one of my fears when you get into specific segmentation is that it's very easy to say, oh, I got this video on my feed because I'm Black, or I got this because I live in a poor neighborhood, right? And how are you making sure that you're not falling into those traps with the segmentation that you're doing?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think you said making sure. We can't make sure, right? Yeah. All we can do is do our best. And so there's a few ways that we plan on doing this. And so I guess to back up a tiny bit and just explain the project a little bit more, because I think you read my press kit, but I'm guessing your listeners have not read the press kit, and therefore they might not even really know what the project is all about. So just to back up a tiny bit more, basically what Better Eating International is intending on doing is building a database of hundreds of short videos that are served as kind of PSA ads that address the various hows and whys of veganism. And these hundreds would only be covering maybe a dozen or at most 24 topics from a dozen or 24 angles, by which I mean it's not that we're going to have 200 different areas we discuss. It's more that we would have 10 to 20 areas we discuss, chicken farming, the dairy industry, vegan nutrition, stocking your fridge, eating out, dealing with social situations, what have you. And then we would make a dozen or two variations of each of those that are segmented and targeted towards the needs of different audiences. And I think that's probably enough background info to then segue into answering your specific question. And the question was, how are we going to do that in a way that, one, I think is not tokenizing, and two, that doesn't make people feel like they were targeted rather than addressed authentically? And I would say the two main ways we plan on doing this are, one, we're building a community advisory panel where we will be workshopping the content of these videos with members of the communities that we're actually trying to reach. And so it's not just going to be the 7 of us, because obviously we can't represent everyone. I mean, we're pretty diverse for a team of 7. It's 4 men and 3 women. It's, one of our managing director is a Black Latina woman. We have another Latina on staff. We have a woman from Vietnam, whose background is from Vietnam on staff. We have a man who was born in Iran on staff. So we certainly have a diverse staff, but ultimately 7 of us are never going to represent all of America, right? It's completely impossible. And so that's where the community advisory panel is really going to be coming in, is making sure that they feel that this content is authentic and meaningful, not just surface level and tokenizing. And then from there, we would actually focus test it on larger audiences, send that out to the world and get actual feedback and see what the engagement is. And we know we're going to make an occasional miss sometimes, right? And I think that something that happens, I think sometimes in the social justice left, is that once people of privilege become aware of how privileged they've been acting in their activism before, they can feel kind of paralyzed and feel like, oh, now I can't do anything because I'm going to mess up. I'm going to fuck up somehow. I'm going to say the wrong term and offend someone. And obviously we need to be hyper aware of not doing that, but we also can't shut down and leave, because that unfairly puts the burden on oppressed people to do all the heavy lifting of of doing all that educational work. And so we have to be willing to say, look, I'm going to listen to the best practices of the communities being affected, but I'm also going to do some of that work myself, and I'm going to own up and be responsible when I mess up sometimes. And I'm sure Better Eating, frankly, is going to mess up sometimes. I mean, we're human, and I am 1/3 of the leadership team, and I am a straight white guy, and so I am completely aware that it's not going to be a 10 for 10 every single time. And the other way that we I had a whole other train of thought that I wanted to say that we kind of were thinking of how we can address this, but I am totally spacing on it right now. So maybe we can just move on, and maybe I'll remember and come back to it or something.
So one of the things that when I was reading and going through the Kickstarter was that you're going to be using animation. And when I first read that, I'm like, well, I know that you're a data guy, and I know that there has to be data to show that gives you just as good as like gut reaction, and people react the same way as real footage. But I'm unfamiliar with that. Are those studies out there that exist that show that these type of animations can elicit the same type of response?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I appreciate your confidence in me that I probably did my research on it. The reality is that the short answer is yes, but the long answer is a lot more nuanced than that. This is not there is not black and white evidence that animation is going to be exactly as effective on a per person basis. And in fact, if anything, if I'm being fully honest, I would guess on a per person basis, if you showed 100 people a video that was animated and 100 people the video that had some live action, probably the live action one would come out a little bit more effective. But there's a couple things here. One, we can't get the live action ones put on to most advertising platforms. And so 2 of us came from Farm full time, and one of us on the team was working at Farm very, very part time. And when we were doing this work at Farm, putting out these videos, we were getting censored all over the place to the point where effectively we would have to recut the live action video so aggressively that it was no longer impactful, that all the meaningful parts of it were cut out. And so what you have to really compare is not the best live action video to the best animated video. The live action would be a bit more effective. But when you compare the best animated video, which there is basically no censorship for, you can show completely traumatizing stuff. By traumatizing, I don't mean towards people necessarily. What I mean is really awful stuff, traumatic stuff that happens to animals. You can show completely traumatic stuff to animals in animation with almost no censoring. But to get the video that passes the advertisers, live action actually is way less effective than the animated one, because you have to show basically no gore, basically no death, nothing, none of the emotional impactful stuff can remain. All you can really show is the confinement, and it can't even show the abrasions and all the other problems happening to animals. So yeah, you can show that they're in a cage together, but you can't show that their wing is that the flesh on their wing is exposed. You can't show their beak getting cut off. You can't show them getting slaughtered. You can't show them dying in the cage in the way that affects the other animals. All the stuff that really shows how horrendous animal agriculture is, you really can't show in kind of pre-roll advertised videos. But for some reason, you can show all that stuff in animation with almost no censorship, which is totally weird to me, but it's true. And the good news is that it's almost as effective. So when we compared, for instance, the best live action video that we were able to make and the best animated video we were able to make, the live action one had a pledge rate through these kind of incentivized video programs that we do. The live action one had a pledge rate to consider exploring veganism of about 80%, and the animated one had a pledge rate to explore veganism around 70%. So we're looking at that much of a drop. And then when you realize you can show it to 10 times more people, being almost as effective, but 10 times more scalable, it ends up being way, way, way more effective.
So what are the benefits of segmenting the audience? Like, why
even do it? Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's the reason is because it works. The reason is there's 2 reasons, really. There's an effectiveness reason, and there's a principled reason. The effectiveness reason is that there's a reason that major corporations and that winning political candidates use audience segmentation. It works. I mean, I know that I'm sure that you guys probably have some issues with former President Obama, and I do too. But, for what it's worth, his 2012 campaign was highly segmented. He was providing wildly different. I don't mean different messages and is inconsistent. I don't really think he's a waffler for any concerns you might have about him. I think he's actually pretty consistent. But what I mean is he was providing different angles to people based on their neighborhoods, based on their age, based on their family status, things like that. Based on whether it was hard mail or email or social media, all sorts of different things he was using to provide people with a different angle, and also whether they were dedicated Democrats that he was more trying to make sure they got out and voted, or whether they were farther left than the Democrats and he was trying to convince them he was good enough for them, or if they were moderates and he was trying to convince them he was better than the Republican for them. So he was providing all of these different angles. And it's the reason that even though he only won the popular vote by a couple of percentage, he just completely destroyed the Electoral College that year. He set up a system where he almost couldn't lose, where even if he lost several more states, he still wasn't going to lose the election. And the same is true of corporations. The same is true of the 2012 marriage equality sweeping victory, whereas marriage equality had lost every single time it was brought to a voter referendum until 2012, and then it went 4 for 4 in 2012. And it's because they completely changed their messaging system, went for a totally data-driven approach, and went for a segmented approach where they treated people who were dedicated to gay equality differently than they treated people that were maybe willing to vaguely tolerate it, for instance. And so we know this works, and we know it's used in advertising all the time for both products and for social causes. And given the giant marketing budget that animal agriculture has, I mean, that's something that we can say for this social cause that we're up against way more money than most social causes are. Not to say that other causes for civil rights and whatnot aren't extremely hard to win, and not that they don't have a lot of obstacles. They do, but most of them don't have many multi-billion-dollar corporations just gleefully doing everything they can to subvert them the way that animal agriculture has, where there is just a whole giant industry that's literal entire bottom line is dependent on us losing. And so we need to get savvy. We need to use the tools that they actually have in their toolbox if we're going to have any chance of beating them and combating them. And then quickly on a principled level, it's just not meaningful to people to give everyone the same message. I mean, people have different barriers and different problems that they're going to have addressing veganism, and getting someone with a lower income or who's a single parent or has a large family or whose cultural foods are heavily based in meat are just not going to move towards veganism as easily or in the same way that some kind of hipster in college is going to, who probably has already been trying tempeh since they were 11 years old. And so it's both an efficacy issue of trying to, use the tools that our enemies are using against us or our adversaries are using against us. And it's also a way of being inclusive and of recognizing that the vegan path for more marginalized folks is not going to look identical to the vegan path of those of us who did it because of our, punk rock subcultures and whatnot.
Can you give us some examples of what kind of videos would be displayed for certain demographics?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're not going to start. You had mentioned, what it's going to feel like for a person of color who gets a very targeted video or something, and we're not going to start with that kind of segmentation actually, for a few reasons. One, we know that's trickier to do ethically, to do properly, and two, it's actually harder to find that information to begin with. But what we can more easily find are age, gender, or expressed gender online, college status, education, things like that, family status, married or not, kids or not. And so one example, a really easy example I've used that's I think very non-controversial is college kids don't buy groceries, really. Or if they do, they're buying convenience foods, and they're often stocking a mini fridge or not a fridge at all. They're just stocking a small pantry or a shelf on their bookshelf with some snacks. Whereas a family, a married family with kids, is buying in a completely different way. And so not only would we target them differently with the shopping videos, but we might just give them a different number of shopping videos. Like, we just might skip the shopping video on college kids completely. If we found that it just wasn't meaningful enough, that yes, even though they do some shopping, if we were to find that in our series of 12 videos that the drop-off rate at the shopping one just went away and that half the viewers stopped watching at shopping, we might say, you know what, even if we make the shopping video way better for them, even if we focus it on mini fridges and a small shelf instead of on a full pantry, if that's just not meaningful content to them, there's no pride in giving them that content. We don't need to give it to them at all. Whereas a family, we might need to give several different videos just on different elements of shopping. We might need to have a whole video devoted to dairy replacement because they see dairy as this life-giving, important part of their kid's diet. And a whole video on meat replacement because maybe the father of the family has this meat and potatoes attitude and he feels like it's not a meal if there's not meat in it. And then maybe a whole nother video on healthy snacks for kids. And so we'll find that maybe a 25-year-old gets one shopping video, a 19-year-old gets 0, and a 33-year-old with a family gets 3 or 4. So that's like a really non-controversial and easy example. Something else we might find is that people on Facebook who list their gender as male or list their gender as female or, don't list a gender at all or use one of the other gender options that Facebook now offers might respond even differently to some of the cruelty messages. It might turn out that men respond more to the bloody stuff, the slaughter and stuff, that's really what gets them, the worst. Whereas people who are women or people on the feminine spectrum might find that the content about, tearing apart families, taking baby cows from the mothers and things like that is more impactful content. And so even the why content could be tweaked probably slightly, although I think the how content is going to be tweaked a lot more aggressively because people literally just have wildly different needs and experiences once you get into what actually going vegan looks like for them.
I don't know about you all, but when I was in college, I would have really appreciated some guidance on vegan dumpster diving. Because that's where my food was coming from.
Yeah, I don't think. Yes, we're going to have the Eating Vegan on a budget. I think probably the dumpster diving video is a very long way off. As much as I also remember how glorious that Trader Joe's dumpster was when I was 19, but.
I explained dumpster diving to my daughter a little bit ago. She's 10, and she was just flabbergasted at the idea.
Yeah. Well, I think I had no clue that either of you had kids. That is super awesome that you're even willing to mention dumpster diving to your kid. That's awesome.
Yeah. Just one of us does. The other one is more sensible.
Is your kid vegan?
Of course.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So what were you already vegan before you had kids?
I was vegan before I got married even. Yeah.
So what are some of the plans to collaborate with local grassroots campaigns?
Yeah, we obviously we're a digital organization, and we're going to be remaining mostly that way for the foreseeable future, at least for the next few years, or the first few years, I should say. But we definitely know that we're not a total substitution for community. We know that a lot of evidence demonstrates that people that have vegan friends are more likely to stay vegan, that people that know other vegans can workshop it, issues they're having, talk about it more, and that also if they become activists to some degree, they're more likely to remain vegan. And so, so we would like to be able to use our location-specific resources, the fact that we're going to be targeting by location to some degree anyway, we can then provide them with the best vegan community groups in their area. So we can connect people with the organizations that are doing great work in their area, both as a means of vegan support for them, so being able to say, oh, if you're, a new vegan, you can go to the potlucks or whatnot being put on by this organization. And also hopefully, maybe that being an eventual way for them to consider doing a little bit of activism a little bit of activism on their own. We also would like, once we are off the ground and once we have more funding, which is, not going to be in the first few months to a year probably, but we would like to be able to provide a percentage of our income as pro bono work for smaller organizations. So being able to say, oh, we can create your little fundraising video for you, or we can create your about, your how, your about video, something like that, just knowing that we have this team that are basically made up of creative and marketing professionals who are vegans. And it would be great if these organizations that are either going to probably have to create either really crappy designed resources or going to have to pay more than they really want to get them outsourced, that we can provide them a vegan kind of almost marketing firm to a degree for, basically pro bono as kind of our giving back to the vegan community, which, obviously the vegan community gave us so much and is like the reason that we're even able to kind of launch a big organization from the start. And so we want to be able to give back to it.
What would happen if you don't get your funding? Does that mean the end of the organization, or is that just, what does it actually mean?
That would be tricky. We haven't talked about it seriously because we are pretty well connected in the movement, and we do believe even if we barely get across the finish line, we're pretty sure we're going to get across the finish line. And so we haven't seriously had those conversations. But I imagine if we did not get the funding and if we therefore had to return everyone's pledges, basically that they would never be charged, we would have to decide to what degree we want to hit up the people that pledged on Kickstarter to provide those funds privately to us instead, and to what degree we should consider is the movement just not ready for this project yet. And I really hope that does not end up being the answer. I think the movement is ready for this project, and I think we need something like this. I think it's time to I think that education has not been taken as seriously in the last few years by the movement as it used to be, and as I wish it would be. There was about 5 to 10 years ago, all the rage in the animal rights movement was doing the most effective behavioral change kind of education work possible. And in the last few years, a lot of energy has shifted towards institutional work, towards, animal welfare improvements and whatnot. And I'm not going to, take any kind of principled or ideological stance against that work. I think that work has benefits. But I also think that you can't get a movement just from institutional victories. You need new people to breathe new life into the movement. And the way to get people to develop an anti-speciesist identity and an animal rights identity is to get them to stop eating the animals to begin with. And so someone needs to do really, really good, really intentional work to help people actually stop eating animals. And I think that, as far as I can tell, we've got the best and most interesting idea for doing that. And so I certainly hope the movement does not let us down and make us have to consider hanging up before we even get started.
So how can people actually get involved, follow the Kickstarter, and donate to the cause?
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I do hate to say that the only way to get involved right now is to give us money, but frankly, right now, that honestly is true. Our campaign is at kickstarter.bettereating.com. So that's a redirect. That's our URL, but it redirects. So again, that's kickstarter.bettereating.com. No hyphens, nothing like that. Or you can just Google Better Eating Kickstarter. And yeah, again, we really do need tens of thousands of dollars more in pledges. And I know that sounds a little hard, far-fetched and hard to reach, but we've been getting it, and every pledge helps, from $5 to $500. All of it will be doubled. And again, if we can get this money, I think we're going to show the movement how seriously the cause is being taken of doing more, work that's more aligned with our kind of deeper justice values, and also work that's very effective and data driven. And so, yeah, I really hope that your listeners will be, compelled to maybe make a pledge. And then down the line, if we get funded, I'm sure we will have lots of opportunities for more interesting ways to help us, more interesting volunteer work or what have you, and maybe even some job openings down the line. But to get us to that point, we really, really need to make this all or nothing Kickstarter goal. And I would be honored if your supporters, who I know are largely social justice vegans, if they found that our project was in line with their work, and if they wanted to make a contribution towards it.
And when does the Kickstarter end?
The Kickstarter ends at 8:30 p.m. Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Pacific on May 10th.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, guys. This is awesome. It's been a couple of years since we talked. We should do it again sometime. You guys, I think we have a lot of chemistry and shared values and whatnot. It's been a pleasure to talk to you guys.
Witchside Podcast is hosted and produced by Jordan Halliday and Jeremy Parkin of the Witchside Media Collective, with web design by Jordan Halliday and sound design by Jeremy Parkin. Booking by Mari Halliday. Go to witchsidecollective.org to check out the other shows in the collective. As always,
this is Brandon Mullins calling from Crossville, Tennessee. Fuck, shit, damn.